Welcome everyone today. My name is Laura Taylor and my role is a policy analyst in the strategy team at Homes England, and I'm here today supporting Homes England's local government capacity centre. I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's summer learning programme. This offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics you have told us of interest to you, and today's session is on the subject of building safety. So this summer learning programme is brought to you by Homes England's local government capacity centre. This slide summarises who we are and what we do. We've launched the centre following an extensive research and consultation with you across local government and with a whole range of other partners to determine where authorities most need support and how this can be best delivered. On the screen now, you should see a breakdown of the session today. Before I run through the agenda, it's important to emphasise why we are here today to discuss building safety. In this 5th year since the Grenfell Tower tragedy, our thoughts should be with the survivors, friends and families of the deceased. The Grenfell Tower Memorial Commission is currently working with bereaved families, survivors and North Kensington residents to develop ideas on the long-term future of the Grenfell Tower site, with a view to creating a lasting and fitting memorial. This session has been designed specifically to provide an overarching view and awareness of building safety in the past, present and future, including the required and identified culture change that is needed across the industry. We'll begin with Will Ardie, who is our Head of Building Safety at Homes England, and he'll be providing further detail on the background to building safety. Following this, you'll be hearing from Steve Truman, who is our Assistant Director of Building Remediation, and he'll be introducing the government's Building Safety Fund. Ian Eaton, our Regional Programme Director, lead of the Building Safety Fund, will then bring some of this information to life with a case study of the Building Safety Fund. And subsequently, Helen Fisher, our Assistant Programme Director of Mid-Rise Remediation, will be providing an overview of the Mid-Rise Remediation Fund. Will Ardie will then be taking over again to explain the independent review of building regulations and fire safety. He'll then provide an overview of the facets of the new building safety regime. And finally, he'll be providing some insight of Homes England's building safety activities. We'll be finishing with a Q&A session, and then I'll be drawing the session to a close with a further poll and a survey in the chat to get some immediate feedback on the session. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Will.
Hi everyone, morning, and thanks for the introduction, Laura. As you can see, my name's Will Ardie and I'm Homes England's Head of Building Safety. I basically provide the agency's building safety technical advisory and support service, and I'm also responsible for promoting the necessary culture shift within building safety, and I work with colleagues across the agency, with partners and the housing sector in general. Next slide, please. So as we all know by now, basically the Grenfell Tower fire happened on the 14th of June 2017, and within the first few days it was really clear that the key factors contributing to both the start of and the spread of the fire were features also present in other buildings. There was a public inquiry ordered looking into the events of the fire at Grenfell, and also the wider issues, with the main aim of preventing a similar tragedy from ever happening again. So the government's building safety programme was established very shortly after the Grenfell disaster, basically to initially remediate ACM cladding, or aluminium composite material cladding, and combustible insulation present on tall residential buildings. And in parallel, the government commissioned the independent review of building regs and fire safety, otherwise known as the Hackett Review. Steve, Helen and Ian will talk about the government's building safety programme shortly. So in the time since the Hackett Review, the remediation exercise, or cladding crisis, as we've all come to know it has really expanded to include other external wall cladding systems and also internal fire safety measures. So as Laura said, we're now in the 5th year since Grenfell, and the subject of building safety is still proving to be as controversial today as it was then. However, just going back, building safety has also been considered and affected regulations in the past, and as far back as 356 years ago, with the Great Fire of London in 1666. So that fire lasted 4 days. Thousands of homes and hundreds of businesses were decimated, and about 70,000 people were made homeless. Interestingly, new regulations were developed, including that houses had to be brick as opposed to timber clad, and it took over 50 years to rebuild the city. But after that, London became one of the safest cities in the world. Next slide, please. So there's long been standing concerns about high-rise safety in the UK that date back to at least 1968 in the Ronan Point disaster. That the image on the top right-hand corner of the slide there is Ronan Point. And more recently, the 2009 Lakanal House disaster in Southwark, which is the bottom right-hand image on your slide. And basically, the concerns rest on the simple equation that the larger or taller a residential building and the more dwellings and people living in those buildings, the greater the likelihood of serious harm from either structural failures, as seen most recently in June 2021, when an apartment block collapsed in Miami, USA, and that killed 99 people. And there's also danger from the spread of flames, heat and toxic smoke as seen at Lakanal House and Grenfell Tower. So Ronan Point partly collapsed in May 1968, and this was only 2 months after it had opened. Basically, a gas explosion blew out some of the load-bearing walls, causing the collapse of one entire corner of the building. 4 people died, 17 were injured, and the failure was attributed to poor design and construction, and that led to a loss of public confidence in high-rise residential buildings at the time, and it also resulted in major changes to UK building regs. These, I'm pleased to say, and at the time, are now embodied in Part A of the building regs and cover what's known as disproportionate collapse. And then we've also got Lakanal House. So that's a high-rise residential block, contains 98 flats and masonette spread over 14 floors. And in July 2009, a fire broke out on the 9th floor. And that spread to involve several floors, and including smoke logging, which affected large parts of the building. Six people died, 15 people were taken to hospital, suffering from the effects of smoke inhalation, and 1 firefighter was admitted for heat exhaustion. So Grenfell Tower was one of the many new tower blocks built throughout London in the late 60s and early 70s. And Grenfell Tower was actually built as part of the larger Lancaster West Council estate. Like many tower blocks to this day across the UK, Grenfell Tower operated a stay put policy in the event of the outbreak of fire, and that policy was based on the idea that if a fire broke out in one flat, fire resistant floors, walls and doors could contain that fire long enough for the fire service to arrive and tackle the fire. With that policy in place, it was never assumed that the entire building would need to be evacuated. But as a result, Grenfell did not have a centrally activated fire alarm, nor did it have multiple staircases. And as we know, the result of this was catastrophic. Around 5 a.m. on the 14th of June, a fridge freezer caught fire in flat 16 on the 4th floor, and when that was discovered, the London Fire Brigade were on the scene within 6 minutes, which is pretty quick. However, due to a catalogue of unresolved building defects in the now infamous cladding and external insulation, which were introduced as refurbishment works in 2016, the fire quickly lost control. 72 people lost their lives, and this basically changed the fire safety landscape forever. Hence why we're here giving this presentation, and you're there listening to us. So 2 days after the Grenfell Tower, a professor of structural engineering claimed that the regs, which came into force in 1971 following lessons learned from Ronan Point, had improved the building's structural strength in such a way to prevent the collapse of the tower. And the day after the fire, the then Prime Minister, I should say, Theresa May, ordered an inquiry to establish the facts of what happened and to take necessary action to prevent a similar tragedy from ever happening again. So that inquiry is split into 2 phases. Phase 1 is basically addressing the events on the night of the fire, and phase 2 investigates the wider picture. And as you'll have seen in the press, there's regular updates daily. Phase 2 is still ongoing. Next slide, please. So very, very quickly, I just wanted to look at some fire statistics. So dwelling fires are actually at an all-time low since comparable statistics started to be collected about 40 years ago, actually. And that's despite the fact that in 2020, people spent a significant amount of time in their homes as a result of COVID, as we all know. Excuse me, 91% of fires in houses and low-rise buildings, basically up to flats 3 stories and lower, while only 9% of fires were in blocks of flats of 4 stories or more. So very, very few fires actually spread from the room of origin. In 2019, 7% of fires spread beyond the room of origin in blocks of flats over 4 stories, compared with 9% in blocks below 4 stories and 14% in houses and bungalows and other dwellings. Excuse me. And only a small proportion of fires in 2020 resulted in a fire-related fatality. So 176 people in total lost their lives in dwelling fires, down from 257 a decade earlier. And this is the lowest number of fatalities from fire since comparable statistics began 40 years ago. So just putting that into proportionality, the population of the UK is about 67 million, and there were just 10 fatalities in blocks of flats with 10 stories or more in 2020. So I guess any death's not acceptable, but we've got to be prepared to accept some risk, manage that risk, and really, most importantly, communicate that risk at all levels. So now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Steve Truman. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Will. Steve Truman, good morning, Assistant Director, Building Remediation at Homes England. Next slide, please. So the government's building safety agenda for Homes England at the moment is principally about the existing cladding remediation funds, of which there are 3. 2 funds that deal with the remediation of ACM material, 1 in the social sector and 1 in the private sector, and then the Building Safety Fund, which deals with the remediation of unsafe non-ACM materials. All those funds are focused on buildings over 18 metres. They're very much government funds. They're very much badged as government funds. Homes England are a so-called delivery partner, and we manage those buildings that are in the fund outside London. We work very closely with the GLA, who are responsible for buildings in London. Just to give you a sense of where we are in time with the management of those three funds, the social sector ACM fund was the first launch in 2018, 69 buildings. We're almost done with that. We have a couple of buildings left to complete and some final payments left to make on just a handful of buildings. And we think we will have completed that fund, that social sector fund, by the autumn of this year, certainly by the end of this financial year. Private sector ACM fund launched a year later, a private sector equivalent of the first fund, slightly less buildings, 40 buildings in that fund, and that fund very much moving into its final phase. We will have all the buildings on site by March 23, and in fact 92% we think of those buildings will have completed their ACM remediation by the end of the financial year. And just as an aside, there are 15 buildings within that private sector fund that also have unsafe non-ACM materials, so a combination of ACM and unsafe non-ACM. So that second fund very much moving into its final phase. So a fair amount of progress has been made over the last couple of years. I mean, these are not going as quickly as anybody would like, and we are all the time looking at the means by which we might speed up the progress of buildings through the funds. The Building Safety Fund is the one that we are in the thick of now, launched in 2020, operating on a completely different scale. We're currently in Homes England working on 461 buildings. I think the GLA have got a similar number, and that's clearly not the end of it. The former Secretary of State, most recently in a letter to managing agents on the 27th of June, said that the Building Safety Fund would be reopening shortly. So we wait to see that happen, and we wait to see whether and what changes will be made to the rules for the reopening of the Building Safety Fund. A long way to go on that, but I think the take home is really that operates on a completely different scale, much bigger proposition, and a much greater number of buildings to work through. In terms of social landlords and the Building Safety Fund, there are two routes into that. Social landlords can apply to the department, not Homes England or the GLA, and make a claim in respect of costs that they would otherwise pass on to leaseholders. Now, obviously, that's the current rules, and the Building Safety Act, as we know, introduced protections for leaseholders. So the department will have to think about how they frame that when they reopen the fund, but that's the current rule. In respect of social landlords' own buildings, there is a route to apply for BSF money, but the social landlord in question will have to pass the department's financial viability test. So the essential point is that if, as an organisation, a social landlord believes it cannot remediate its own buildings without destabilising the organisation financially, then it is able to apply for funding. Only a handful of social landlords have come through that route. Perhaps that isn't surprising. The one thing that we do know about the Building Safety Fund now and going forward in the future is that we are having to sort of blend it with the developer pays concept. People will be well aware that the former Secretary of State had made great progress in getting the developer industry to pay for its own mistakes, as he would have put it, no doubt. And I think there are currently 48 developers that have signed the pledge to, at their own cost, remediate the buildings that they were responsible for developing or refurbishing in the first place. What that means, I think, for the Building Safety Fund is that some buildings will come out of that fund where the developer has accepted responsibility for those buildings, and where the developer has accepted responsibility for buildings which are quite well advanced, the expectation is that the developer will reimburse the department for any grant paid out on those funds. I saw something in the paper this morning that said that the current Secretary of State has now sent out contracts to all the developers who have signed up to that pledge, and he expects those contracts to be signed within a month. So seemingly no let-up on the pressure being applied to developers to sort out their own house, but that will happen in tandem with the continuation of the Building Safety Fund, which, as I say, we are expecting will reopen shortly. That's a very high level canter through what building safety means in practice for Homes England at the moment. And I'm now going to hand over to Ian Eaton, who's going to give you some more details about an actual building that we're working on. Ian?
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ian Eaton. Excuse me, I'm one of the regional programme leads here at Homes England. I've been at Homes England now for 2 years, but prior to that, I worked for a number of managing agents. So I've seen and had a flavour for how building safety is being dealt with on the leaseholder side of things, and it's pretty tough. But delighted to be part of a Homes England team delivering remediation projects and funding for remediation projects going forward. Next slide, please. Purpose of, I think we've gone backwards. What I wanted to try and do today was put a little bit of meat on the bones in terms of building safety and looking at a case study of a particular building that I was involved in very early on when it first came through. Thanks. Next slide, please. When it first came through to the Building Safety Fund. It's a building called Hill Quays, which is right in the middle of your screen on the map here. This next slide really what I wanted to try and demonstrate to the audience really was the number of schemes that are involved. Steve has obviously articulated 461 buildings, but just within a relatively small area of South Manchester, there are 15 buildings that are already in the Building Safety Fund that are being at various stages being remediated in this tiny area of Manchester. And what we're seeing is a similar theme in other city centre areas. I'm sure most of you will, or some of you will know this particular area of South Manchester. Hill Quays then is the building that we're going to talk about today, or I'm going to talk about today. It came through in late July when the fund was initially announced. It's a typical mixed-use scheme consisting of 266 residential apartments, a mixture of 1-bed, 2-bed and 3-bed, and also underpinned by some commercial units. There are 7 in total on this particular development. The applicant submitted an initial sort of registration when the fund first opened, and there's a stage at which a building needs to go through, which is handled by our department colleagues, which is an eligibility piece. So before a delivery partner, either Greater London Authority or Homes England, receive an application, it has to go through that eligibility check. So the wall types are verified by our department colleagues and their professional team. And once that eligibility piece is passed, it's then handed over to a delivery partner to facilitate their various checks that go through to get through the process to funding. So next slide, please. So some key milestones on this particular area, on this particular building. So it came through on the 31st of July, entered the fund. That means it effectively passed the eligibility piece, came through to Homes England. Once an application's passed through to us, there are various checks that we need to do on the applicant, making sure that it's the correct entity. And the applicant or responsible entity in the sense of building safety is the entity that, under the terms of the occupational lease, would, under normal circumstances, were Building Safety Fund not to be around, would be the entity responsible for undertaking those repairs to the cladding system. The second check we then carry out is whether, in the absence of the Building Safety Fund, that applicant will be able to pass on those costs to leaseholders through the mechanisms contained in the lease by means of a service charge. So they're the 2 checks that we carry out in the initial stage of the Building Safety Fund. And once you pass that process, then we enter stage 2. Stage 1 was completed by this particular applicant on the 16th of October. And they elected not to request pre-tender support. Now, pre-tender support in the sense of building safety is a fund that or an amount of money that we're able to give to applicants to assemble their professional team. So if they're not at the point where they've appointed a professional team, pre-tender support is there to help them facilitate that, because we obviously appreciate that service charge funds are quite tight. This particular applicant didn't elect to do that because they'd already assembled a team, so we moved fairly swiftly through to stage 2. Stage 2 is what we call full works and costs. So the applicant is preparing their costs with their professional team that they think it will cost to remediate the building in full. This particular applicant applied for £5.8 million worth of funding. The issues on this particular building were high pressure laminate with combustible insulation and a render system that also contained combustible insulation. So there was pretty much an extensive covering of those two elements across the whole building. Once full works and costs are submitted, we then, with our Homes England consultants and cost consultants, look at those costs and challenge any reasonableness of those costs. Applications are then taken to FAB with our recommendations, and the Funding Approval Board, as it's called, will make a recommendation for grant. Initially, that 5.8 million was submitted. We engaged, and the applicant and their representative were very engaged in this process. And what we managed to do was make a saving of just over £1 million. So the amount that went to Funding Approval Board at this stage was only 4.7, the original 5.8. So we do challenge costs. We do make sure that everything is reasonable. And the applicant accepted that, and we went forward to the next stage. So in order to facilitate funding, there are a set of legal documents that are required, and one of the most important being the grant funding agreement. The grant funding agreement contains not only the payment tranches and the way that the payment is made to the applicant, but also the start on site date and the practical completion date. It also talks about what you can and can't do with the funding, and contains mechanisms for any cost or time variations as well. There's a series of conditions precedent that have to be met. One of the most important ones is the signed works contract. So everything needs to be in place. Collateral warranties need to be in place. Any duty of care deeds also need to be in place before we can facilitate any start on site payment. And as you can see here, the start on site payment was made just before the 9th of August. They started on the 9th of August, and their estimated completion at that time was the 12th of August 2022. So I'll come on to that a little bit more if we could just move to the next slide, please, because that date is going to slip on the basis of the discussions that we regularly have with the applicant and their representative. So one of the main reasons was an issue around the scaffold erection. Instead of taking 9 weeks, it took 13 weeks. These photographs, by the way, on the screen here are actual photographs that I took when I was on my site visit. So you can see it's quite an intricate scaffolding regime. We've also got to bear in mind that people are still living in these buildings. So you'll see that just by the high-vis jacket there, that's basically somebody's balcony looking onto this sort of central piazza area. So we're always, and the applicants have to be mindful of that. Once the scaffold was erected and the applicant started removing elements of cladding, there was a backing board that they found that wasn't part of the original eligibility, that needed a specific test to fire rate it. So they were a little bit worried that may impact on cost, but also the time that it would take to remediate the building were those tests to come back as negative and it needing remediating. Recently, I'm delighted to say that came back as an A1 rated board, so it didn't need replacing, and obviously the cost implications weren't borne. Little bit sad really of myself, but I found this quite interesting. A system called Protector Glaze was being used on this particular application to protect leaseholders' residents' privacy and also protect the windows from any damage, during the construction phase. So there was basically a gentleman going around with a roller, putting this stuff on the windows that would obviously protect them and give leaseholders some privacy, because as I pointed out, the scaffold is literally going past people's windows. And quite creatively, once the work is completed, you can peel this film off, and it also gives the windows a nice clean. So I find it particularly interesting. You may not find that interesting at all, but I thought it was a quirky way of dealing with a particularly difficult issue. Next slide, please. Again, this picture is when you're dealing with applications remotely, as we have been doing up until fairly recently, you don't sort of understand the workarounds that contractors have to deal with when they're working with a live building, so people living in them. As you can see here, so this area at the top of the building is a sort of open communal space. And that parapet wall has had all the cladding removed, but obviously Manchester being Manchester, the weather's not great. So they sort of made this makeshift frame to protect that particular area from weather and obviously further costs had they not thought of this particular solution. Contractors also utilising rock wool insulation in the voids that were found once they removed certain areas of cladding, just to give that extra level of protection, which again I thought was a great workaround. Hillkeys itself, with it being the size it is, benefits from a 24-hour concierge and security presence. That's particularly important with a view of protecting leaseholders from the waking watch cost that would have probably been the case given the extent and type of cladding that was on this building. So again, just giving you a flavour of the type of building that we're dealing with. Next slide, please. The on-site meetings for us, I think, are very, very useful. And what I gleaned from my site visit was the level of engagement that this particular applicant has with their leaseholders. Homes England are very sort of hot on making sure that leaseholders are kept up to speed in terms of where the programme is up to, what elevation of scaffolding is going to be erected, and just general communication about the whole thing, because you can imagine leaseholders living in a building, with effectively a construction site next door. It's not a nice place to be. This particular applicant's rep has an office on site. That helps. So they engage with leaseholders regularly through meetings and also via their Facebook page, which I thought was quite a quirky way of dealing with communication. Unfortunately, there are some issues with, or have been some issues with, subtenants using that scaffolding to run up and down and create issues. And we did have one report of one resident having a barbecue on the scaffolding poles, which we just didn't quite believe. But these are the types of things that applicants and applicants' reps are having to deal with, given the demographic of the types of building we're looking at. Works do continue to progress well on this particular building. As I alluded to earlier, there will be, or has been actually, a cost and time variation submission, all of which is dealt with via the GFA and various checks that we do then with our department colleagues to make sure and verify that those costs are reasonable. The initial submission was for £450,000. What we're finding is material costs are increasing. Inflationary costs are also coming into play here as well. So we're always mindful of that. But again, just to let you know that there are checks and balances in place to make sure that we are verifying those costs as reasonable. Within the full works and cost submission, there was actually a £200,000 contingency. So actually, in terms of quantum, the cost variation will be circa £250,000. I'm afraid that's a very whistle-stop tour of just one building, one example of an application that we're dealing with. If there are any questions, please pop them in the chat. We'll do our best to answer them. But that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Helen, who's going to talk a little bit more about the mid-rise remediation fund. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, so I'm Helen Fisher. I'm the Assistant Director of the Mid-Rise programme. And this is actually a really exciting opportunity for Homes England to kind of set out at a high level the progress it's making hand in hand with the Department of Levelling Up and Housing and Communities in this space, and what our plan is for the future. I'm just going to set out a little bit of context, but can we move on to the next slide? And I think that sets the kind of scene to this. At the beginning of the year, there was a fairly sizable review commissioned by the Secretary of State, and that was carried out by the Boston Consultancy Group. What came out of that review was that there were some fairly significant challenges with the operating model that we were working to. And that was the kind of way that we were operationalizing this split across a number of different firms and the departments having a delivery role, as well as Homes England, as well as a GLA, and the complexity that was kind of causing in the market. As Steve alluded to as well on the Building Safety Fund and the 400 units, this next cohort, including the mid-rise kind of height of buildings, is actually around 6,000 to 7,000 buildings, which is a real shift in its volume again. And Homes England had to really step back and look at how we'd reflect on that. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Brilliant, thank you. One of the ways we started to look at this was to set out some design principles of how we intend to work on building remediation as an organisation with DLUC moving forward. And we set out those kind of principles to almost look at how we could respond to the BCG reports, how we could respond to some of the challenges we saw from users. And we went around the market and interviewed a fair few of the users that had taken part in the predecessor funds of the ACM cladding and the building safety. We set these out, and I'm not going to kind of go through them all, but I think focus on users, so focus on the people who are actually in this process and what they need from it and how we can provide that to them and identify the needs really clearly up front from those users. And then I think also the big shift to making sure that we're being, kind of delivering a value for money service here for government, across government, in a time when we all know there are really challenges around there. And then a real shift towards proportionality, so being proportionate to the level of risk that we hold here. Certainly that is something that's significant in a policy objective as you move on to the mid-rise cohort of buildings within this space. And that 6,000 to 7,000 buildings that we have here, there is around 80,000 within England, of which we think that 10% hold a risk because of potential external wall systems and cladding. We also kind of had a little look at how we could make sure that we have a real data-driven process here. One of the issues of the sporadic operating model and people taking small slices of that means that we don't have a clear line of sight of data. Therefore, we aren't pinpointing the issues within the market quick enough. That means that we're not enabling government to respond to those challenges as quickly as we would like to. Capacity of fire risk assessors, issues with demand and kind of the market generally with supplies, etc. Having clearer, more ready data within a digital platform is something that we've really been trying to kind of enable here. So we set out these design principles, and I think that data-driven one was a really clear, kind of driver for us. If we go on to the next slide, please. And then at very high level, where we've ended up is a scheme that one of the most significant changes is that as we approach April next year, Homes England will be responsible for the full delivery of the remediation grant funded programmes. And that means that Homes England is supporting the Department of Levelling Up with a broader building remediation programme of where you've got the responsible actors scheme, you have the builders that are getting on with remediating their own work themselves, and how all of that is tying together in a market response to building safety. And what we looked at here was what are the market drivers that are going to help administer this programme. So things like the Building Fire Safety Act, which Will is going to cover in more detail, having that change of culture and really starting to drive traffic, leaseholder pressure, the changes that were made to who pays and the responsibility of payments, really starting to add pressure onto building owners and their administrators to bring them forward and start that remediation programme. Looking at then how Homes England can react to the more pull-in space and looking at how we utilise our digital services, financial and technical support for people, so making sure that people have access to the right type of technical skills they need to identify that they have a problem, and how we really do leverage that and support the market to make the changes it needs to make. And then also building on our responsibilities and relationships with local authorities, to ensure that the appropriate sticks and carrots are being used to get people into what is effectively then a funnel. And then you pour all those buildings through and you've got your fire risk assessment of where if you meet the benchmark of medium and not tolerable and high risk fire safety, that you will come through to the grant scheme within Homes England. And then moving forward from the autumn onwards, we'll be piloting this process with some high-risk buildings, of where we'll be doing that within a digital environment with real-time data, and starting to look at how we open that to the market and share that data more broadly and more widely across the sector, that including local authorities, so they can see the buildings going through this and being subject to that, as well as lenders, so lenders can start to see the progress being made on buildings as well, to enable them to open up and get the market lending again. So that's a real whistle-stop tour of the progress that we're starting to make in this space. We should start to see some more announcements from Homes England coming out into the market from October, November time this year. But I'm going to pass back over to a lady who's going to continue with some more information on the Building Safety Act itself. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Helen. So really what we've done there is we've looked at the past, the sort of legacy, if you like, of our buildings and the state of the industry as it's in. What I'm going to do now is just spend the next 20 minutes or so looking at the recommendations to both change the culture and the system, and then we'll have some Q&As. So next slide, please. So in September 2017, the government commissioned Dame Judith Hackett to review the building regs and fire safety. And it took 2 months for an interim report to be published, which called for a universal shift in culture. And then there followed in May 2018 the report, as we can see the picture on the right of the slide there, Building a Safer Future, the independent review of building regs and fire safety was published, and that basically set out 53 recommendations for the government to deliver a more robust regulatory system. And basically finding that the regulatory system, particularly for high-rise and complex buildings, was not fit for purpose. The government, I'm pleased to say, accepted all the recommendations and pledged to implement a new reformed building safety regime. And basically the Building Safety Act, which I'll come on to in a bit, is the vehicle to deliver many parts of the new regime. Next slide, please. So the review's purpose was basically to make recommendations, as I've mentioned, and really to ensure that a robust regulatory system for the future is set up, and really to provide more assurance to residents that the complete system is working to ensure buildings they live in are safe and remain so. But in summary, the report called for greater clarity around duty holders, new regulatory bodies to be formed, as well as a framework, tighter rules around product testing and disclosure of product information, a clearer, more responsive framework for residents' concerns. So that's basically, I'll come on to this, but it's basically two-way communication, which wasn't happening before. A new competence framework across the industry, and also probably one of the most important things, the digitalized information exchange, also known as the golden thread of information. So one of the recommendations was creating a vehicle to promote building safety and the new culture and all the commitments. So the Building a Safer Future was created, and basically to promote an urgent and positive culture and behaviour change in the safety of the built environment. And it's all about really putting people's safety first in how we plan for, design, build, maintain and look after the safety of the buildings we all live, work or play in, and protect those that use them. The charter, similar to the new regime, currently covers all high-rise residential buildings higher risk and in scope that are constructed or refurbished, and those that are 18 metres or 6 stories high. That'll probably be changed to 7 stories to align with the new regulations, and it believes as do I, and that we all should, that all buildings of whatever height should apply the principles of the Charter. I'm pleased to say that Homes England are a signatory of the Building a Safer Future Charter and now require its delivery partners to be signed up members as well, and that's been included in the agency's DPS or delivery partner system as a pass-fail requirement, and I'd urge anyone on this call to get their company to sign up if they haven't already. Next slide, please. So similar to the Building a Safer Future Charter, as a responding to the recommendation in the review to introduce tighter rules around product testing and disclosure of product information, the Code for Construction Product Information has been developed, and that again, same as the Building a Safer Future Charter, promotes urgent positive culture and behaviour change in the approach and management of product information by the construction product manufacturing industry. So really it's aiming to ensure that misleading marketing practices, as we've seen with the insulation on the Grenfell Tower, and also the provision of misleading product information, becomes a thing of the past, so that those using products in the construction and maintenance of buildings, as well as ultimately, most importantly, the end users of the building, can trust the information provided by manufacturers when making design decisions, installing, using and maintaining verified products. Next slide, please. So just with the time that we've got, I'll just briefly look at some wider industry initiatives that are and have been going on, and one of those is the implementation of the early adopters group, and that's basically assisting the government and the HSE in the development and testing of secondary legislation. I'm pleased to say Homes England are a member, and that comprises of several developers, housing associations and local authorities, really across board. There's also focused industry-led working groups, and they're reviewing professional competence standards across the industry. Focused fire safety training has also been introduced for house builders, developers and consultants. And there's also an update of industry-related guidance, including the review of external wall systems. So that would be on the likes of BBA certification being updated and what have you for product materials. There's also a product manufacturer literature and accreditations have been updated, and standard setting organisations such as the LABC and NHBC have updated guidance for fire safety measures in low risk housing. Also, another one that springs to mind is the Structural Timber Association. Next slide, please. So now I'd just like to look at some of the bits of facets of the new building safety regime and what is involved. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I said, we've got the background, we've got the recommendations. So really, what does the new regime look like? So in July last year, Robert Jenrick, who was the Secretary for Housing, introduced a revised draft of the Building Safety Bill into the Commons, and that bill followed a 3-year scrutiny and public consultation, basically laying out a whole-scale reform of building safety regime, as I'm sure most of you on this are aware, going off the initial poll. And in line with the recommendations of the Hackett Review, it's really the most fundamental reform of regulation across the construction and residential property sectors that any of us can remember. So the Building Safety Act and the new regulator covers all buildings, not just high-rise residential. That's really important to take that on board. It addresses how we design, build and renovate our buildings in the future. And amongst other legislation, it also introduces changes across the board to several acts and the building regulations, so that the more robust safety regime will take a proportionate risk-based approach to all building work, including remediation. And it'll look at new, as I've mentioned, new competency requirements for those who design and build, as well as for operators of high-risk residential buildings. When I'm talking about operators, I'm probably talking about building owners and facilities managers and the like. Next slide, please. So the Act creates, as I mentioned, a building safety regulator, and they're responsible for the regulation of all buildings. It creates an entirely new, more rigorous regime for classes of buildings with new planning and building control gateways. There's also building safety cases and a statutory golden thread of information, which are all linked to a formal certification of the building for its fitness to occupy. And the bill or the Act as it is now will also strengthen the whole building control system, with the new regulator taking responsibility for professional standards of building control inspectors. It's a strengthened regime for high-rise and other high-risk buildings, aiming to improve the accountability, and it also applies to buildings owned or occupied by the Crown and fall within the scope criteria, i.e. buildings over 18 metres. And that's in line with the Fire Safety Order and Health and Safety at Work Act. So the scope, as I've mentioned, it applies to all multi-occupied residential buildings of 18 metres or more in height, or more than 7 stories, whichever is reached first. And over time, the scope may change based on emerging risk evidence. Organisations really will have to adopt, if they haven't already, appropriate management systems, processes, policies, and really resources to carry out their function under the regulations and ensure that individuals who carry out the work for them have the appropriate skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours for the role. So really, it's all about competence. There'll also be designated duty holders that'll have to have accountability and responsibilities for managing risks across the design, construction and occupation of buildings on an ongoing basis. And this is similarly linked to CDM regulations, the construction design and management regulations. And then gateway points within the design process and construction process will also aim to provide inspection of the requirements, regulatory requirements, I should say, to help ensure building safety risks are considered at all stages of the building's design and construction. The bill or the Act will also give residents in these buildings more routes to raise concerns about safety and mechanisms to ensure concerns will be heard and taken seriously. And there'll also be extending rights to compensation for substandard workmanship and unacceptable defects. And these claims will be able to be made retrospectively. And I'll come on to that in a bit. Next slide, please. So I've just popped this slide in. There is a government's version of this slide, but dare I say, I've just tried to clarify the 3 stages, if you like, of both the passage of the bill to become an Act, and then the introduction of the regime and secondary legislation going over to its eventual transition, if you like, when the whole industry will have to comply regardless. So how long we're looking at? We're looking at, so we've got royal assent, so the Building Safety Act is law, and then over the next 6 to 12 months, most of the regime will come into force, and then, yeah, the bulk of the regime will come into force, sorry, within 12 to 18 months. However, this could quite easily go into 2-year period. So we're looking at late 2023 to 2024. So what I'd like to do now is just look at some of those provisions. Next slide, please. So the first and one of the most important is the new building safety regulator, who is at the heart of the Building Safety Act. Peter Baker was appointed Chief Inspector of Buildings in February last year, and he's currently leading up or heading up the Building Safety Regulator, who sits within the HSE and also has a responsibility to report to the Secretary of State, who may or may not be changing in September. We will see. The regulator already exists in shadow form, as we know, and responsible for developing and implementing the new regulatory regime, and also establishing and consulting with 3 advisory committees on building, industry competence and resident representation. So the 3 main functions are overseeing the safety and performance system for all buildings, including managing the performance of building control bodies and inspectors, assisting and encouraging the improvement of competence and improving building standards. So it's all about quality, competence and quality. And there's also, they will have powers to order remedial works and stop non-compliant works on higher risk buildings, and also appoint special measures for failing projects, and order the replacement of key duty holders and fire safety officers. Next slide, please. So another regulator to be set up is the Construction Products Regulator, excuse me, and they'll operate within BEIS, Business for Energy and Industrial Strategy, under the Office for Product Safety and Standards, and they'll have powers to remove products from the market that are seen as a significant risk, and prosecute those companies that don't comply with product safety, and also they'll establish a complaint system to handle industry-wide issues, and they're also likely to establish a register of safe products to be used in the construction industry. So hopefully that will be a go-to place for when you're specifying products on a particular scheme. And they'll also lastly have wide enforcement powers, including the ability to conduct product testing. So you'll have heard me mention the golden thread of information, and I dare say most of you will have heard of the terminology before. So the golden thread of information will be established for high-rise buildings. There is information out there now on .gov.uk, and this basically ensures that the right people have the right information at the right time, and again, just it's all about making sure buildings are safe and risks are managed effectively and communicated. So basically what will it be? So it's about key information that's developed throughout the design and construction, handed over to the building owner completion, and developed over the lifetime of the building by the relevant duty holders and accountable persons. And when I'm talking about accountable persons, that's basically the building owner or the client, if you like. So in effect, the information is going to pass from the land feasibility stage to the technical team, to the construction team, and then to sales and or the management company, and then ultimately to the building owner, and then to the residents. So it's just a passage, keeping information up to date and passing that information on. It's got to be stored digitally and based on information and data required through the gateway points, which I'll come on to in a bit, as well as the building registration process and safety case. And at the moment, there is a regulation 38, that covers just the requirement for the contractor to hand over information concerning fire safety to the responsible person. Next slide, please. I've just pulled this slide together, basically outlining what the building safety gateways are, and basically these are the key stages in the building life cycle of which the duty holder has to satisfy the regulator that the plans are robust, their understanding and management of risk is appropriately detailed, and they can properly account for the safety of the as-built building. There's amendments to the Building Act, not the Building Safety Act, the Building Act, which was set in 1984, coupled with existing powers, allows for the creation of this new regime. And this is, again, to ensure that building safety risks are considered at each stage of a building's design and construction. So the building safety regulator, who I've just spoke about, they're responsible for overseeing the building work and ensuring that the appropriate measures are being implemented to manage that risk ultimately. And the gateway policy will be implemented through law, and it'll set out the practical details of the gateway's approach. The Act will also provide powers to prescribe documents, or I'm saying will, it is prescribing powers to say which documents should be supplied with building control applications, and that includes now a signed declaration from the client that they've assessed in a content with the competence of the principal designer and principal contractor. Next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight Gateway 1, which has already been introduced, so that's in effect now, and it applies to planning applications made on or after the 1st of August last year, so 2021. And it's basically utilising the existing process by basically for planning permissions in England, taking through in secondary legislation and statutory guidance, which we should all know as the Town and Country Planning Order. The government response to the Building a Safe Future consultation said in that, and I quote, "To aid the local planning authority in their decision as to whether to grant planning permission, the developer will be required to submit a fire statement setting out fire safety considerations specific to the development with their planning application." So there's basically two elements to Gateway 1. To require the developer to submit a fire statement setting out fire safety considerations specific to the development, and to establish the HSC, or the Building Safety Regulator, as the statutory consultee for relevant planning applications. And just to emphasise, relevant buildings under the Gateway 1 must contain 2 or more dwellings or educational accommodation and be 18 metres or more in height, or 7 or more stories. However, that categorisation may be lowered. Next slide, please. There's 30 pieces of legislation referenced, and I'm just aware of time, so I'm going to quickly go through a couple of those now. Next slide, please. So the Fire Safety Act received royal assent on in April last year, and that amends the FSO, or the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005, and it's complemented by the Building Safety Act, as the whole building is subject to the new regime and enforcement by the regulator. It applies to common parts and any other non-residential part of a multi-occupied residential building, and is not specific on height. So new fire safety obligations that have come in to some leaseholders, building owners and managers for building structure, external common parts and doors between domestic premises and common parts. So it's it's the assessment of the external walls and the common doors that has come in, and that's an important point to take on board. So really what you need to be doing now, if you're responsible for a building, is updating your fire risk assessment to include those parts, to include the external walls and the doors. And at the moment, non-compliance could result in enforcement action being taken against the responsible person. But this is basically providing a foundation for secondary legislation which won't require a further act of Parliament, and it will also incorporate recommendations from the Grenfell inquiry, the Grenfell Tower inquiry, which I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So there's quite a few amendments to existing legislation and some initiatives. I'm just going to quickly go through these. So there's the Architects Act 1997, and basically there's amendments to ensure greater competence amongst registered architects, and that sits alongside wider competence requirements for those carrying out design and building work as part of the Building Safety Act. There's also the Defective Premises Act, which is enabling tenants and owners and anyone else who has a legal or equitable interest in a property to bring a claim for defective work, mainly where the work renders the dwelling uninhabitable. And that act proposes to introduce several important changes, and the main one is for me that it will significantly impact on claims by building owners, extending the limitation period from 6 to 30 years. The acts imposed also implied terms in tenancy agreements, and that's covered by the Landlord and Tenant Act, requiring residents and owners to comply with landlords who are accountable persons in the building safety duties. There's also a new Homes Ombudsman, which is actually in effect now, and that being established, and that's basically to resolve complaints from homeowners about developers, and that's voluntary at the moment until the legislation is in place. But currently home warranty bodies such as the NHBC, LABC, Premier Guarantee, etc., they all require registered builders to adopt and comply with the code as a registration condition. And lastly, I'd like to touch more on this, but we are short on time. There's the resident engagement strategy, which is a localized plan for delivering resident engagement, should be linked to the community engagement as well. And it outlines how the duty holder will share information with residents, how they inform residents of their rights and responsibilities, and how they consult residents on changes to the building which could impact on safety. Next slide, please. So how much is the new regime and everything that I've just spoken about going to cost? And very quickly, there is information, as you can see on the link at the bottom of the slide, but you're looking at 426.8 million. A large proportion of that will fall on the industry, some by the regulators that I've mentioned, and other requirements. And then just to build that up, there'll be annual recurring costs for 2 years, estimated at 812 million, with again the industry incurring a large proportion of that and the regulators incurring 81 million pounds. And as I said, there's a link there. So next slide, please. Okay, so just as well as the Building Safety Fund activities that are going on that Steve, Ian and Helen described earlier, there's also some initiatives going on in the agency where it's all about embedding and developing awareness of building safety, as we have been identified as a leading agency in promoting both the new building safety culture and ongoing implementation of the new regime and beyond. Thank you, and I'll now hand back to Laura. Just aware of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Will, and thank you to all today's presenters for delivering a really comprehensive presentation. I've certainly learned a lot from it. We've had a lot of questions in the chat, some of which have been answered already, and I can see there's been plenty of discussion going on, which is really good. But we'll now spend some time answering some of the most popular questions. We've got what is being done for existing properties that may be owner occupied that people are struggling to sell because of cladding issues.
Yeah, again, I'm sure Steve will pop in here, and I think I mentioned that in the chat, responded to it. But this is all about the RICS AWS1 form and how the building's assessed. And each building, I've got to stress, has to be assessed individually. So it's up to the constraints of the building, whether the building owner is going to pay for the defects, whether the developer's going to pay for the defects. But firstly, what you have to do is take a step back and say, well, what's wrong with the building? Has it been professionally assessed? And then I'd recommend, if it hasn't, as part of the fire risk assessment, you need to get if there's cladding, suspect cladding identified on a building, you need to get a fire engineer involved, a professionally qualified person who looks at that and uses what's called PAS 9980, which is basically the assessment, or its guidelines that have been produced in January this year, looking at the risk, proportionate risk of a building, and categorizing that risk into high, medium or low category. And if it's obviously assessed at medium to high, then there will be some sort of fire safety measures that need to be implemented by way of refurbishment, and there may be funds available to do that.
Thanks, Will. That was really, really detailed and helpful. Thank you. Steve, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that one.
Just to sort of restate what I said in the chat. I mean, these are the properties that the funds are focused on. You know, the first and foremost, it's about making buildings and people safe. But I think, you know, there is an acceptance that a sort of byproduct of doing that will be to help get the mortgage market moving for people again. So obviously, you know, if you're unable to sell because you're in a building where the cladding is unsafe, once that is fixed, the assumption is that, you know, that it will be much easier for people to move. So focus on making buildings and people safe, but a sort of a useful spin-off benefit is that this work will get the mortgage market moving again.
Great, thanks, Steve. Thanks, Will. That's really that's really answered that question. Thank you. I've got one for Helen. I think Helen, I think this one, see if this one, you're happy to answer this one, but is, how do you see leaseholders being kept informed on the progress?
Yeah, I mean, I think from just following on from what Will and Steve said, I mean, when we think about why these funds exist, you know, it is because leaseholders have been impacted by the, you know, kind of the impact of what happened at Grenfell. The burden that they bear with that is that there is a huge amount of anxiety from leaseholders, and I think as an industry as a whole, you know, there is a responsibility to do better to keep them informed. We've tried to look, and I think some of the things that we'll set out are tools of which, you know, kind of the Building Safety Act and other regulatory requirements of how we engage with leaseholders. We have absolutely within Homes England no desire to act as an intermediary across the whole market for leaseholders. However, within the scheme design moving forward from the autumn onwards, one of the conditions of grant being received by building owners will be that everyone can evidence good quality and proportionate almost communication with leaseholders, and that will be one of the requirements of the scheme and one of the requirements of grants, and I think that's really important as well, the point of lenders. So one of the things we are doing to improve that engagement with leaseholders will be to open up data to lenders to assist spreading the kind of updates of those buildings to lenders as quickly as possible, so that we can ensure that people and stakeholders hear a message once and try and kind of streamline that level of communication for leaseholders too across the market.
Wonderful, thanks Helen for that. Ian, I'm coming to you next. And the question is, what support mechanisms are in place for applicants going through the Building Safety Fund?
Thanks, Laura. Excuse me. Yeah, each application that comes through is allocated initially a caseworker. So caseworkers tend to operate on around 15 or 20 applications, so they can really focus and drill down into the detail. There are also then, depending on what stage they're at in the process, there are client-side support providers that can offer assistance on a whole multitude of things to the applicant. We also hold quite regular engagement sessions with industry, so that ranges from sort of project managers, property managers, and they attend those monthly sessions. You know, they're pretty well attended. Then you've also got our legal advisors and our cost consultants who are engaging, more so the cost consultants engaging regularly with our applicants and their teams to ensure that costs are reasonable. So there's lots of things in place to help applicants through this process. But the first port of call is our caseworkers, and they're pretty knowledgeable people now in terms of how the process works, and tend to resolve a lot of the issues. But as I say, if there are any issues that need to be escalated, then we have mechanisms in place with our department colleagues. So yeah, fairly comprehensive.
Thanks, Ian. That's a really great answer. Thank you. We're running out of time, so we'll see how many more we can get through. But Will, we've got two questions here sort of linked on the golden thread information. So one of them is, does some of the golden thread information sit within CDM health and safety file anyway? And then there was another one linked to that. Will this be supported through the use of BIM, ISO, and then I think it's 19650 as best practice?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I've placed a couple of responses already in the chat just while colleagues have been answering questions. But yeah, in summary, the HSC will be the statutory building control authority for high-rise buildings, and there's also, in the golden thread of information, there's what the UK BIM framework, which is referenced in there, and it refers to ISO 19650 as well as other guidance. So I would recommend having a look at that because it's very detailed and laid out, and if it's implemented, I would say it should be used as best practice for other schemes, not just high-rise developments or high-risk developments. Did that answer all the questions? I think so.
Yeah, I think so. That was great. Thanks, Will. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions, but any questions that we've not got to, we'll definitely make sure we respond via the local government capacity centres email and stuff and come back to you. So yeah, we'll make sure those questions are answered soon. So like I say, unfortunately, we're out of time for today's session, but I'd like to thank all the presenters, Will, Steve, Ian and Helen, for their fantastic presentation today. I'd also like to thank the Local Government Capacity Centre for their hard work behind the scenes to organise and facilitate the session. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to thank the audience for taking the time to join the session today and engaging in the chat to ask plenty of thought-provoking and insightful questions. And if you've got any questions, please do get in touch with the Local Government Capacity Centre. So cce@homesengland.gov.uk, and there's also a telephone number there. And these slides will be circulated after with those contact details. And finally, if we go to the next slide, please. To finish today's session, we've got some take-home messages, including top tips and a list of other key organisations that you might find of use. And I'd like to conclude this presentation by once again thanking the audience for your time and contributions today, and thanking our speakers for again delivering a great presentation. Thank you everyone, and have a great afternoon, and goodbye.